Wonderful. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. And first, just a brief overview. So we'll give an overview of the survey that we did and our respondents. We'll then talk a little bit about scientific priorities, those barriers, what's on their mind from a technology perspective and purchasing. We'll go into factors that are affecting productivity, and then finally share some critical factors and thoughts about what you can do as leaders to really move forward for the remainder of the year. All right, so as many of you may remember, we took a survey at the end of Q4 last year to ask our scientists, what's on your mind for 2022? And really what we were finding was that, and we'll reference this study as Q1 data, as they're thinking about what was going to happen for 2022. So Q1, our scientists were thinking about, 39% were really estimating that they would be more productive in 2022. 63% said that they were going to be able to purchase new technology. And then 60% of them said adopting new techniques into their work was a top 3 priority. They entered into 2022, as most of us did, very optimistic about work. And, when they were thinking about which technologies they were thinking about, CRISPR, AI, and multi-omics were on the top 3 scientific technologies. Their concerns as they moved into 2022 were about reproducibility, inclusive experiments, and then lack of correlation between data sets. So what's on their mind now? Well, there's some things happening in the economy, as we all know, right? We have lots of headlines, lots of different indicators from an economic standpoint. Jerome Powell is even confused, right? And, The Atlantic just wrote the everything is weird economy. So what's really happening in our industry? We took a snapshot of data of scientists just recently, and we'll share more about what's on their mind and what they're thinking. So who did we talk to? So a sample of 133 scientists from around the world. The types of organizations you can see on the left-hand side. So 29% of them were in biopharma or research development, 20% in academia or research university, and then 17% in pharmaceutical research or development. Their functions spanned research, administration, and academia. And then the majority of our responses, our scientists were in North America, but we do have Europe covered as well at 17% of our respondents.
Okay, so thank you for that. Just one note to bear as we're comparing this against the data that we took about 5 or 6 months ago. Each of these were an independent recruitment effort, which means that these are not the same people who responded. It was basically a new random sampling. And, we actually, when we do our insight work with clients, we have a sense of what's happening and the changes that are happening. And so, we're using that knowledge as well in total to really describe the shifts that we're seeing. So, but this 133 is just basically a pulse check into what's going on in our market. So let's actually talk about which techniques and applications and scientific priorities our respondents are really interested in and which ones they're not. We gave them a long list and we asked them to rank what techniques are their number one interest as they're thinking about pushing their science forward. And CRISPR and cell line engineering seems to have captivated the attention and the hearts and minds of our scientists' priorities. It seems to be continuing from Q1 with respect to being of interest. Machine learning and AI, especially around bioinformatics, this is not a surprise because AI is maturing and the data that our respondents are dealing with is large and cumbersome. And so to be able to identify trends and whether structured or unstructured is really driving a lot of interest. Third generation sequencing is actually something that came up as a solid number 3. The one thing to take into account is that this data were taken right before AGBT conference, where sequencing is on the mind and lots of new there's anticipation as far as new technologies coming on board. But we just wanted to make sure that we're mentioning that. What were the least 3? Obviously there's just a smattering of things that were in the other category, but immunohistochemistry didn't really seem to be driving a lot of attention, and super resolution microscopy, which is actually a burgeoning technique, is not really on the minds of the greater population right now as being able to drive science forward. Just very quickly to compare this between what we learned at the very beginning of the year. Again, like I mentioned, CRISPR and cell line engineering were really top of the line. AI, ML, enabled bioinformatics. But here's where the switch happened. Multi-omics investigations dropped in our list, and in favor of 3rd generation sequencing. So this ability that 3rd generation sequencing can bring more biological context or just more information about the genome seems to be of greater interest to our response set this time around. Another question that we asked them was just what are they thinking about, with respect to their priorities? How are they going about doing this? So obviously, it's really heartening to see that adopting new techniques for our work is number 1. But number 2 is finding new collaborations, and that's quite interesting. And those 2, as you can see from the graph here, really overshadow everything else that are happening. Automating more techniques is also interesting, but then it's sort of everything else is middling, adopting machine learning. Also, we asked them things about like skills and labor, because we've heard so much in the news about labor shortages and skilled versus unskilled, or the Great Resignation, where people are just looking, personally to switch jobs. Those didn't really seem to be high priorities with our responses. They're, toward the bottom there, recruiting low skilled or recruiting higher skilled colleagues. They are favoring collaboration. And remember, this was not a highly academic group of respondents. So, while you would think that collaborations are really more on an academic side and don't really happen in biotech or pharma, our data suggests differently. Okay, so what does all of this mean as far as their interest? There's this rise in need for collaboration. Why? We ask ourselves why. And combine that with everything that you just heard with respect to AI and machine learning. What they're really looking for, we believe, is that they're looking to add different data types into the biological system of interest that they're either researching or developing for, in order to basically push their productivity forward. So it's, again, what we see here is looking for more biological context and really grounding, ground truthing biology moving forward. So that's the signal that we're hearing as far as their priorities.
And what's getting in the way? What's getting in the way of progress? And there's a few things, and notably we'll talk about the differences between Q1 and Q2. But really, we asked this quarter, in your opinion, which of the below are the top 3 barriers in life science research and development in 2022? And reproducibility remains number 1. Number 2, experiments that really are leading to inconclusive results. And then there's this lack of standardization. And really what our hypothesis is here, and we all know this, is that biology is pushing so far ahead that the standards of the past really aren't keeping up. And you'll see this even as we compare Q1 data to Q2 and what's happening today. So if you can look at Q2 on the left-hand side, where you see number 3 is lack of standardization, that wasn't on scientists' minds in Q1 of 2022. We're also dealing with some extrinsic factors, so supply chain issues. You'll see that come up as well as we're looking more about the industry and barriers to purchase. So again, lots of factors here. Reproducibility, number 1 challenge. But we are, and this is no surprise, and we anticipate this will move through the rest of this year, that supply chain issues will persist.
That's part of why we were actually looking into this data, because you're hearing so much about what's happening in the labor market, what's happening with supply chain, inflation. And that was really a key question to us. How much is this actually affecting the behavior of our life science community? There's one thing, if even if it doesn't directly affect the behavior, there's a psychological effect that people are feeling. And so we wanted to see if there's any truth to that in the time that we have right now. So that actually comes to the next section, which is what we asked them about technology purchase intentions.
Sure. So one of the questions that we did ask, again, at the end of 2021, looking at 2022, as well as this quarter, was, do you plan to purchase any new technologies for your work in the remainder of 2022? In Q1, we saw these numbers flip that you see on the screen. So essentially, 63% of our respondents in Q1 said yes, they are planning on purchasing new equipment or new technology, and then 37% said no. So in Q2, we see those numbers flipped, as I just said. So 65% said no, and 35% said yes. So I know all of you are probably thinking, what's happening? Is it the economy? The answer is no, and we'll break those answers down, or maybe a little bit. So you can see that a lot of the purchases may have already been purchased in Q1. So 25%. So 1 of 4 respondents said that purchased new technologies within the last year. Over a third did say lack of funding. But then if you look at the left-hand side and you look at those extrinsic factors, 11% of those factors had to deal with something that was happening sort of beyond their control. So 5% continued disruption from the pandemic, 3% due to inflation, and then 3% relate to supply chain issues. So those are sort of the factors that are really contributing to why they weren't planning on purchasing new technology and for the remainder of the year.
As we're diving into this, that begs the question as far as that's going to affect on the productivity of science. And at first, you may actually think, okay, if they're not purchasing, then are things coming to a standstill? Are things slowing down? If there was a sort of a measure of GDP equivalent in scientific productivity, are we going to see a negative effect on that? And the answer is no. And the number actually, that 35% didn't scare us one bit for a couple of reasons. Number one, when people think of major technology, they think of major capital equipment. But technology could be, a novel way of doing sample enrichment, which is really, chemical technology, chemistry technology that's sold in the form of consumables. And that's just not how these people are thinking when they're answering that question. But let's actually take a step back from the productivity perspective. Some of you who have been listening to our work since the pandemic started may recognize that in March of 2013, we actually developed this projection of productivity due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2020, excuse me. So that was
we're blacking it out.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. The last two years and some months have just been such a blur. But look at the way that we predicted that things were going to happen, and sure enough, a lot of this happened in 2021. There was a surge during the transition, and now we're in this weird next normal. And we did actually assume that net productivity in the next normal was going to flatten out higher than in 2019. And so let's actually see, but before we go there, let's actually see how the productivity is netting out. But as a result of doing this work during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were invited to give this presentation or the presentations that we had to so many boardrooms, to so many investors, and to so many C-suites in companies large and small. And one question came back to us over and over again, and it really shocked us, which was that most of us on the commercial side of supplying science think of productivity as number of samples processed. That's essentially how we think about it. And that's not wrong, because that's how we can actually translate it to how many boxes we're going to sell, how many instruments we're going to sell, how many kits we're going to sell, and so on. But the reality is that that's not how the majority of science thinks about productivity. So let's actually take a look at how they said that they think of productivity in in our first, Q1 survey and how that's changed. So Q1 is really denoted in the yellow, and Q2, our most recent, is in the blue. And you see here a shift. So number of samples processed by about 10% of the people in Q1 said that that's how they're measuring productivity. It's basically nil now. And you can see exactly where the number went, which is specific milestones. And so they're really looking at generating meaning, and the work that they're doing is not about sort of just rote process and just, increasing the speed with which they do things or doing more with less. It's about the meaning that they're generating and the milestones that they're meeting. And so, please take this into consideration if you're in a commercial, or an operational role within the supplier companies, is that we need to communicate with your customers where they, how they think about their productivity, and really lean on that meaning as the end point of how they're thinking about productivity. But how is it going to change? So let's actually look at it. We asked the question, and we actually said, the question was, if pre-pandemic year 2019 was the baseline, for the remainder of 2022, are you considering it to, your productivity to be net higher, net lower? And you can see here a spectrum, and you can also see that 44% between, somewhat and significantly higher are actually, have the mentality that they're actually more productive and they're going to continue being more productive. 34% are saying they're back to the pre-pandemic levels. So that's a huge number. And only 23% are saying that they're still experiencing lower productivity than 2019. So we asked them why, and let's take a look. The ones who are estimating that their productivity is going to be lower, again, it's those extrinsic factors. COVID-19 pandemic was 27% of those respondents. Supply chain status and supply chain issues, as well as changes in level of interaction. So that basically means that their job is changing, and above them it's changing. Or it might mean that they're just not having access into those collaborations that they were enjoying in 2019 or before. But look at what's actually driving productivity higher, and this actually is really interesting to us too. Changes in roles, project, or organizations. Companies have reprioritized and have reoriented themselves around this new way of working. And 33% of the people are actually saying that that's why it's driving higher productivity for them. More experience. The world is different. It's been almost 4 years, or 3.5 years since the pandemic disrupted everything. And so that means that there's actually new learnings and new ways of doing things. And then finally, remote work, which is really, you listen to the sort of the business discourse around whether remote work is higher productivity or lower productivity. 16% of those who are saying that their productivity is going to be higher is because of remote work. So, let's take that into consideration. As many of you are suppliers, you would think that time away from the bench actually means lower productivity. And our scientist community is saying that actually time away from the bench is actually heightening their productivity. So go figure that one out. But let's synthesize what where we are with this productivity. So, and then we can synthesize the entirety of our conversation here. So productivity is less and less about generating more data or more data points. It's about meeting specific milestones. And also people are thinking about, how do I work smarter, not harder? And it's not just about working smarter from a logistical perspective of like, how do it actually goes all the way to experimental planning and, ground truthing that biology even further. How can I get the farthest by doing the least? By asking better questions, by designing better experiments or better protocols and moving forward from there. So it's not just about buying robots or buying new detection mechanisms, which still 33% are still planning on buying those kinds of things. But they're also thinking about fundamentally changing the questions that they're asking and how they're going to answer those questions. So let's synthesize and talk about what the 3 critical factors are that we're learning at this point in time in what's happening in scientific productivity. The first one is that scientists are being more selective in their work. So again, there's only so much time in the day. There's only so much time at the bench. There's only so much sample availability or the amount of data that they're willing to generate. because also part of this is that the data that they're generating today has a repercussion about all the AI and all the bioinformatics that they have to do in the back end. And so generating the rote data isn't as interesting to them. So they're looking to drive meaning. And again, that meaning is really dictated by the understanding the studies and combating that biological complexity that they're facing every single day. So this is why they're investing heavily in AI and also seeking collaborations. So that's really where their mindset, this respondent set, that's where their mindset is for, that they're willing to share.
So as a leader, it would be good to, as you're going through planning and figuring out, what's next, you can ask yourself, what are we doing to help scientists drive meaning? What are we doing to help our customers really think about this perspective? Yeah. And how are we really trying to enable partnership and collaboration?
Absolutely. So that's all, that's all absolutely true. And I think it gives us a really nice and solid indication with respect to how you might want to think about positioning your offerings. The other thing is basically, and when we talked about this, there may be a switch between sort of valuing data point, right? So we've heard so many of these sort of economic value drivers in so many parts of life science, like price per whatever, price per run, price per sample, price per data point, price per base pair. And there may be an opening where people are actually shifting and asking themselves, okay, what is the value of that data point? Is that, I always say this in any kind of data, whether it's marketing data or scientific data, data is like calories. It can come from a variety of sources. You can get calories by eating broccoli, and you can get calories by eating candy. And what that does to your body is a very different effect. And it's the same thing with where we are in this moment in time, at least with this respondent set. So really looking at the value of the data that they're generating, because it has upstream repercussions and downstream repercussions for them. And so they're really looking at that and making decisions based on that, which we think is actually really provides all kinds of opportunity, as Kristin mentioned earlier.